Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you all. We are going to continue in Mark, reading Mark 2, and I'm going to ignore the chapter break to take us from Mark 2:23 through to Mark 3:6. So Edmund, do you have your...
Yeah.
Wonderful. Right, let me get the screen. So those of you who've not been recently, Edmund's been reading from what version?
It's the Complete Jewish Study Bible. It's a Messianic Bible, very popular among Jewish believers.
Great. So Edmund, would you like to read the passage 23 through to 3:6?
Okay. One Shabbat, Yeshua was passing through some wheat fields, and as they went along, his disciples began picking heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they violating Shabbat?" He said to them, "Haven't you ever read what David did when he and those with him were hungry and needed food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is forbidden for anyone to eat but the priests, and even gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "Shabbat was made for mankind, not mankind for Shabbat. So the Son of Man is Lord even of Shabbat." Yeshua went again into a synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to accuse him of something, people watched him carefully to see if he would heal him on the Shabbat. He said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Come up where we can see you." Then to them he said, "What's permitted on Shabbat? Doing good or doing evil? Saving life or killing?" But they said nothing. Then looking them over and feeling both anger with them and sympathy for them at their stoniness of their hearts, he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." As he held it out, it became restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately began plotting with some members of Herod's party how to do away with him.
Excellent. Thank you, Edmund. So, Sabbath. Edmund, do you want to lead on this, on Sabbath?
Well, I thought I'll let you do the more academic theological stuff, and then I'll tune it into what you say.
Yeah. I don't have a huge amount on this on the technical side. The commentator said David's conduct included that of his men, and the relationship between the Old Testament story and this infringement of the Sabbath by the disciples lies in the fact that on both occasions pious men did something forbidden. So what David did was forbidden, and actually technically what the disciples did was forbidden. Yet Jesus uses this to argue that the tradition of the Pharisees is unduly stringent and exceeds the intention of the law. Because as with many things, the Pharisees had built fences around the law to protect it. And so to avoid accidentally breaking the law, they put these fences around so that just to keep you at a distance so that you wouldn't actually break the law. Could you give a bit more detail on that, Edmund?
Yeah, okay. I mean, obviously, all the way through Jesus's ministry, you find the questions about the Sabbath crop up, because it is one of the fundamental things related to being Jewish is the Sabbath. And there had been a phenomenal amount of debate over the previous couple of generations before Jesus's time, trying to sort out how you interpreted the the commandment. And in the end, they land up coming up with a number of categories. It all depended on what was classed as work, because the original command by God is that you're not to do any work on the Sabbath. And all the debates were around what constitute work. And I mean, if you look at the ultra-Orthodox today, they really have sort of agonized over this, but as so often when you digging down into things, the thing becomes more and more and more prescriptive until you can hardly move. And if you're among ultra-Orthodox today, they're so anxious, they won't even, they'll organize their light switches so that they come on automatically, because putting the light switch on, the logic goes, that is electric, that's power, so you're causing energy, and therefore to switch on a light switch, ultra-Orthodox Jews won't do that. So they have time switches which work on the Sabbath, and they're very careful not to do anything that might be conceivably in the nth degree connected to working. And this is part of that process. And you have to remember that, again, Judea, they had developed this since coming back from Ezra Nehemiah time, coming back from Babylon. That's when Jesus talks about the traditions of when they talk about the traditions of the fathers, you haven't washed your hand according to that's what they're referring to, the code of rules. And the Sabbath was absolutely surrounded with them. But if folk remember last week, we were talking about Son of Man and Son of God. And in fact, it's the opposite way round to what we're used to, that the Son of God is this Daniel 7, Son of Man rather, is the Daniel 7 messianic divine figure that sits down alongside the Ancient of Days. He says here that the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. He's again pointing to the fact of his divinity. And that takes you back to the very beginning of the Sabbath, because the Sabbath, and this is where I'm wrestling through questions at the moment, because in point of fact, the Sabbath, although it's included in Sinai, it goes right back to the creation. The seventh day of the creation is the Sabbath, and it literally means the seventh, and it's a day of rest. And it's always, all the way through the Old Testament, it's never man's Sabbath, your Sabbath, it's God's Sabbath. But the church, in leading up to about 630s, when they brought in a final rule to try and distance the church from any Jewish connections, they said, we're not going to follow the Jewish Sabbath anymore, the Saturday. It's going to be on the Lord's Day, the Sunday. And when the Reformation came along, for some reason, the Protestants threw out all sorts of Catholic things, but they did not throw out the ban on the Sabbath. And so we've got very used to the fact that we talk about Sunday as being the Sabbath. But if you go back to the beginning, it's God's Sabbath. And so God's Sabbath is still in place. We may have a special day we set aside, but the question that I'm thinking around that, we got some people like the Seventh-day Adventists who use Saturday as a Sabbath still. And interestingly, the Ethiopian church, which is one of the major churches, it's the only one that wasn't affected by Rome, it developed completely separately, they still keep the Sabbath on a Saturday and the Lord's Day on a Sunday. because they were never under the influence of Rome. So questions are, and you'll look, if you see in Jeremiah and leading up to the exile, it's fascinating that the Lord says at a couple of places, if only all the things they've been doing, which are broken God's heart, and then he says, and I think it's Jeremiah 16, I think it's in Jeremiah 16, I haven't got it written down, sorry. He says to them, look, if only you would keep my Sabbath, let alone all the other things they've been doing, if only you would keep my Sabbath and honor it, then there will always be a king coming into this city, and the city won't be torn down. And that's extraordinary. And if you begin to look, you see this thread all the way through the Old Testament, how seriously God sees the Sabbath. But they dressed it all up in these, as Simon said, fences around the law, and put in all sorts of codes, which it was never meant to be. So it became a straitjacket rather than what God meant it to be, a day of joy and release from all the pressures of the week and what have you, and turned it into a burden.
Edwin, can I just jump in there? I'll just share screen showing the original commandment from Exodus. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So it's an interesting thing as well that this was also a protection for servants and slaves and animals. So it's not just you Israelites take a day of rest, but you must rest your animals, you must rest your servants, the people who live amongst you, you can't exploit them. So it's also has a social aspect of protecting those in society who, would not have control of their own destiny. So that is an interesting addition as well. And it doesn't specify what work is, it just says labor. And I think the problem came in when they started trying to define what the word labor means. And they started bringing in all these fences and protections so that they didn't accidentally do it. So to the point where, yes, the ultra-Orthodox have their lights on automatic switches for the Sabbath. And if they live in a tower block, the lift will just cycle from the ground floor to the first floor, to the second floor, to the top, stop all the way up, stop all the way back down, so that they can just get in the lift and get out as and when it eventually reaches their floor. And if they want to go down, they have to wait. So they've taken it to a real extreme, I think, by, I'm not sure at what point they'd actually defined how far you could walk during Sabbath. So there's a limit to the distance that you can travel.
That's in the New Testament, a Sabbath day journey. That it was in place. That's about half a mile.
So that was it. That's the
maximum. In place by Jesus's time, yeah. That one.
So how did they differentiate that? Who was the arbiter that a half a mile was a Sabbath day walk?
I haven't seen how far back that goes. I think it's to do with what's at the heart of it is when I was in Boston, I was staying in a part of Boston which was the heart of the Jewish community, the very wealthy Jewish community part. I think there's another place where there were poorer folk, but looking out the window on Sabbath was extraordinary because it was like in Victorian times, people used to go out to promenade And it was just like that. There were these elegant families, all the wives in furs and all their jewels and everything, walking up and down. You could go out for leisure walks, but they thought if there was a walk which had more to it than just going to synagogue or just for leisure, for fresh air, you know, COVID-19, go out for a walk, that's all right. But if you're walking longer than half a mile, well, what's going on there? Why are you doing that distance? It's sort of around that sort of thinking. And out of that came that limit, I think.
You're allowed to promenade, but you're not allowed to walk on a journey.
Yeah.
I heard something interesting on a podcast I was listening to about someone just recalling a time they'd spent in Jerusalem, and in the main food market there, which is quite adjacent to an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. The young guys from the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, half an hour before sundown, run through the market with trumpets, blowing the trumpets, giving people a half an hour warning that the Sabbath is approaching, and to start, you know, like the call we get in the supermarket, we are closing at 7 o'clock. Could you please proceed to the checkouts because, you know, we're closing. Yeah. And it was, you know, they go around blowing these trumpets just to warn everybody, half an hour. And then I think they do it at like 15 minutes, and then they do it at 5 minutes, and then the market closes.
Yeah.
I'm going through. We can talk now.
Oh, good.
Hi, guys.
Can you? Should I mute the Smiths? Let's have a vote.
One of the interesting side aspects of that, if you can walk half a mile but no more, that means that we're very used to going to whatever church congregation we feel suits us. Okay, whereas biblically, that's not the basis on which you went to synagogue. You went to the one which was the closest. So it meant that all shades of theological persuasion and none, if they were at the synagogue, whether they were God-fearers, full Jews, or people who were wanting to become Jews, whether they were Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, they would all be in the same congregation. You don't get one type of one theology of Jew in this synagogue. If you went, I mean, Gamla was the headquarters of the Zealots, and probably in that region there were rather more Zealots per head of the population than other parts of Galilee and whatnot. But you wouldn't only have Zealots in their synagogue, you'd have whoever was there. And that is always challenging when you think about it, about the way we choose and how we interact with people who differ from us. I mean, I would not have liked to have sat a Zealot next to a Sadducee, because the Zealots liable to have a little knife in, and I think they did occasionally. But you get the point I'm making. It's interesting that it's the Sabbath rule, which means that you relate to your community, not just where you happen to theologically feel at home.
Interesting.
So, my understanding was that this distance was probably the distance between the Ark of the Covenant and the people when they marched with the Ark.
Oh, where did you see that?
I hadn't come across that. That's interesting. I think
yeah, and also I think with the Levitical cities, they were given land of about 2,000 cubits beyond their limits. So it's the same sort of distance. There's a whole load on it, I think, you'll find.
What's your source for that, Janet?
There's a thing called the Encyclopedia of the Bible. And if you look in there, you can find stuff about Sabbath day journey.
Yeah,
they reckon it's about 2,000
cubits outside the cities. That's yeah, I know that.
And they reckon it's about the distance from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem.
I haven't seen that one before. That's interesting.
So I think there's quite a few things, or also maybe that the Israelites were not told to go out and collect manna on the Sabbath, but they could walk that sort of distance if they wanted to. So it's fun. There's lots of things, I think.
Yeah.
But that's where I found it.
But that's one of the things I find fascinating about Jewish commentaries. You know, the ones that like the Talmud and the Mishnah and all that sort of thing, is that you can have different explanations of exactly the same thing. Another rabbi will use a completely different explanation, and they're quite happy with putting them all together, and they may be even contradictory. Some of them may be coming from completely the opposite end, but for us, we like there to be one answer. Do you know what I mean? And it's quite difficult to get your head around the fact that, but this rabbi completely disagrees with that rabbi and says exactly the opposite, and yet it's put in here as an interpretation. So they're more interested in the process of how you think about things than whether it's the way we would do it.
Mike Smith, I rudely interrupted you, and then we all trampled all over you. So what were you going to say, my friend?
I forgive you all, but no. I was going through the Beatitudes, and it's just interesting where Jesus says that it says, "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and scribes, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." So those poor old disciples, thinking, perhaps looking at the Pharisees and how strict they were at that, and then obviously the verse before he says about, I say to you that truly I say to you, heaven and earth will not pass away until each iota and dot has been accomplished. And so Jesus is there to fulfill the law for us, but what we're reading, it must be so shocking. So shocking to the people at the time.
I'm not sure they would be shocked with this. If you came from Judea, you would be very much stricter about the Sabbath than you would be in Galilee. We were talking about different schools of theology. You've got Hillel and you've got Shammai. They're the two famous ones, the great rabbis from a generation around about 50 years before Jesus. And Jewish scholars look at Jesus and say, in almost every case, he's very similar to Hillel. There's one exception when he talks about divorce, and it's word for word what Shammai said about divorce. So they would see Hillel is considered to be the compassionate rabbi who interprets things in the widest possible way to include, whereas Shammai was very, very, he was a very godly man, but very, very almost legal. So Jesus always is going towards the openness of God, which Hillel tends along that same line. They're very similar in the way they think about things.
I don't know. Obviously, I don't know all the names, all the Pharisees and everything else, or the various teachers and rabbis.
No, all I was saying was that there's a whole range of thought, and they would recognise what Jesus said. He didn't say anything particularly new. He amplified things that was already around. We tend to think, he came along and did a whole new thing. There's almost everything you can link back to something that was around at the time.
If that's the case, why they went out to try and kill him? Because
it's mostly they're afraid that he's going to upset the political situation, cause problems with the Romans who'll come and take away their position as the rulers in Judea, and also he is very fierce against people who are in authority, like the judges, like the people handing down stuff from the Sanhedrin, because, as he says when he's telling off the lawyers, you lay heavy burdens on people's shoulders and you don't lift a finger to help them. So you're very quick to tell them what is expected of them and then sit back, fold your arms and say, now what you're going to do about it. And that is not, when God gives a rule, it's in order to liberate us. It's a road to walk on that makes it open for us. It's not, God's laws never close you down. They always are offering you, you know, I've found when the Lord, the few occasions when the Lord has clearly sort of pulled me up on something, he tends not to do that, I think, because I'm probably, if you've got children, you know, some children you can be quite robust with, and it sort of watches over them. Okay, Dad, okay, Mum, whatever. They're not thrown. But other children, if you were to use that same technique, they'd be squashed. And I realised that because of the way things were in my childhood, I tended to say, oh, the Lord doesn't, you know, wave a stick or anything like that. Well, that's not quite right. But the times when he has pulled me up short, and they would be less than the number of fingers on one hand, I'd never feel pushed down when the Lord has told me off. It's always, oh, I can do that. It's somehow I don't feel diminished like I would with the headmaster or my parents or something like that. Somehow when the Lord corrects you, it's almost, you really think I can manage that? And I feel affirmed even in that. I don't know how else to explain it. But God's law is always, it's a gift. The Jews always talk about the law as a joy. They will dance carrying the Torah scrolls, because this is the great delight that God has given them, the way to walk in the world in the face of all the Gentiles who do not know God. It's a thing of joy. We've been badly taught down the centuries about the law, and because we lost our Jewish roots that would have taught us that. And Jesus is saying, this is how the law should be lived. You don't just, you know, even if you speak negatively someone, it's as if you've murdered somebody. It's the wrong line to go down. And it's one of the most difficult things to communicate, that his heart is always open in all the commands he gives. That's why, because, as I read this morning, you know, where love is the fulfilling of the law, the person who loves, there's no law against love. If we understood it properly, every law from God comes from the love of God. And if we understood it properly, instead of seeing it as, oh, something I've got to walk narrowly like this, we're entering into the love of God. And therefore, of course, I will treat you in the way that God would have me treat you, rather than as a selfish human being, I might treat you. It's all to do with the love of God. The law is the love of God, always. It's all summed up in the law, in love. Love God, love your neighbour, said Jesus. This sums up the whole of the law.
And Mike, you referenced Jesus saying, you know, if you're not more righteous than the Pharisees. I think I was listening to a very interesting teaching on righteousness recently, and our English word, the way we have used the word righteous, isn't the way that the Jews would understand righteous. And the Jewish word for righteous is living the right way with people. It's a very relational word. And what the Pharisees weren't doing is they weren't living in a right way with people. They were very judgmental. There were those who were in, there were those who were out. And so that's why they, you know, condemned Jesus for, you know, why does he eat with sinners? Because they were out. and so the Pharisees weren't living in a right way with their neighbors. They weren't living in love. And so when the Pharisee said, about the two, what's the greatest law? And Jesus said, the first is love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. And then the second is love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, who's my neighbor? He's looking to narrow it down. And then Jesus obviously teaches on the Good Samaritan and at the end of that says, who was the neighbor? And, the neighbor was the Samaritan. So the Pharisees were being more righteous than the Pharisees wasn't keeping the laws more accurately. We've turned righteous into believing it's about being right or wrong. And that isn't the original idea of righteous in the Old Testament. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about living correctly with people. And the Pharisees weren't doing that. They were judging. They were deciding who was good, who wasn't. So, the Pharisee who went up to pray and said, at least I'm not like this other man. They were judging, and Jesus came to show, do not judge. Because as you judge others, so you will be judged yourself. And that's a very sobering statement that Jesus made. Edmund, do you have any comments on righteousness as a word in the Old Testament?
I was just thinking how that was the topic for Josh on Sunday, righteousness and justice. It all links into that same thing.
Yes. Hence why I've been listening to teachings on it.
Right.
Have you anything to add on righteousness, Edmund?
I guess it worries people a bit again because of what we're used to thinking. But if you think that Noah is classed as righteous, Abraham, is classed as righteous, and all the way through the Old Testament, the comparison is between the righteous and the wicked. And then when you get into the New Testament, John the Baptist's parents are referred to as righteous, and yet we are very fond of the verse, there is none that is righteous, no, not one. And that tends to come to our mind first. So the idea of someone claiming or suggesting that someone is righteous always makes us slightly worried on that account. Whereas in God's terms, we can walk righteously. That has nothing to do with salvation. That has nothing to do with salvation. And the Old Testament doesn't say that it has. But
I'll ask a question here. Sorry, Edmund, I interrupted you. Carry on.
Yeah, no, questions are fine.
I just picked up my ears about this. Cornelius, he's spoken of in Acts as somebody who's, I guess, righteous because God is pleased with him and so on. But wasn't he a worshipper of Diana or something? I mean, he talked about him worshipping God, but he wasn't a Jew. He wasn't obviously a Christian. He was actually a Roman citizen, wasn't he? So
he's a Roman citizen. He's not Jewish. But
no, that's right.
He is a God-fearer. That means he has said, I do not like the pagan thing. I like this Jewish way. I am drawn by this God of the Jews. I think he's the right one. He hadn't had the snip, so he wasn't Jewish.
Yeah.
Right.
Did he know about Judaism?
Oh yes, he's a God-fearer. That means he was going to the synagogue, and he was praying. That when it says at the time of the afternoon prayers, that's 3 times a day you've got the prayers, and that was the Jewish afternoon prayers he was doing when the angel came to him. Yeah. So he has left the pagan world, but he's visiting the synagogue, and he's worshipping the one God.
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And in giving, it says that his gifts and whatnot, which was acts of charity, be supporting, because they haven't got a support service, so that he'd be giving money to the poor and looking after widows and orphans, as James describes it. That's true religion. right?
Yes.
That's where Cornelius was. And God's looking and saying, this man has got a heart for me. I'm going to use him to introduce this whole next stage of bringing
Right.
Gentiles in. So he's a God worshipper.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Edmund. Thank you. That's good. That's helpful.
Yeah.
On the righteousness piece, I'm just going to share. I've just been pulling this up. Hang on a minute. Where am I? I'm going to pull up a passage from Job 29, and this is Job making his defense to God and talking about being righteous. And this is Job. He says, "Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me, because I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist them. The one who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I put on righteousness as my clothing, and justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from my teeth." So that's righteousness. And so when Jesus said, your righteousness needs to exceed that of the Pharisees, that's the righteousness he was talking about. And a lot of those things that Job said, that's what Jesus came to portray. So, it's. I think
it's the sheep and the goats, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we have. We've adopted a false reading for the word righteous, because when we hear Jesus saying you need to be more righteous than the Pharisees, we think we have to keep the laws better than they did, and we think, how is that possible? But he wasn't talking about law keeping. He was talking about living in a right way with those around you.
So
does that make sense?
Well,
Mike? Go on, Caroline.
Is there a distinction then between, I personally had taken righteousness, because in Romans it talks about righteousness being a gift from God that we already have received. I've always taken it that the righteousness is about our rightness between us and God, primarily. And then that is reflected in our right relationship with other people, rather than it primarily being about living rightly with other people and then pleasing God. I've always taken it that because our relationship with God is right, then we have right living with others. And that is how it can be a gift, because it's impossible for our relationship with God to be right unless he gives it to us as a gift. So I've always seen it primarily as being right with God that has consequences.
I think living right with our neighbours, therefore pleasing God, it's not that way around. It's we live right with our neighbours because we're reflecting God's nature as we're bearers of his name. We talked about it last week about we were talking about not taking the Lord's name in vain, as in don't bear his name in vain. So don't bear, because we're supposed to be bearers of his image and bearers of his character. And so we live rightly with those around us because we're reflecting God's nature.
But we can only do that if we have the gift of righteousness.
Well, yeah, because we find it very hard to do, but through God's grace, making us his sons allows us to reflect his nature more clearly.
So the righteousness is in the first place between us and God, isn't it?
Yeah, because that righteousness in Paul is obviously it's a different word because it's Greek, and I believe that the Greek word is actually an amalgamation of righteousness and justice, so which is two separate words in Hebrew, but when they translate them into Greek in the Septuagint, they use the one word, and I believe that's the word that Paul uses. Edmund, do you know more? Have you got any
No, I was trying to think of something that Josh had said on Sunday, which said something about those two things fitting together. But I think the thing is that it's when you see your face in a mirror, which one comes first?
The faith.
Well, when you're in front of the mirror, there isn't a first and a second. They are, you can't separate the image in the mirror and you can't have that image without this image. And if there's no mirror, the righteousness that God imputes to you and the righteousness out of which you live towards others, it's not separable. In the first letter of John, John says, you cannot say that you love God and hate your brother. You can't. The two things are indivisible. And I think the same is God about what God reflects to me, what God flows from God. I'm like the pipe in the middle. So the righteousness that I walk in towards my brother is a continuation of the righteousness that is flowing from God. And likewise, when I'm looking back at God, it's the two things aren't separate at all. I don't think it's an either or. I think they're two sides of the same coin. They are sides, but it's
can't do it the other way. You can't really do it the other way around, because that's what the counterfeit is. That's that is religion. The other way around, when people, lots of the cults today, they can sacrifice so much to be loving, to be everything they're supposed to be, but they're still not in right relationship with God. Well, there is a sense, I suppose, where it could be the other way around.
I tend to have a bit of trouble with that one, because we tend to say in the West, it's interesting, the Eastern Church doesn't do this, but we tend to say, and that's taking it to extreme, Calvin or something like that, that it's impossible for someone who isn't saved to do a good thing, really. It's not the real thing, because it has to be God. So if you're not a Christian, you're completely sinful, and therefore, even when you think you're doing good, you're not doing good. Well, I don't think that's what the Bible says. I think that every good thing, when people out in our streets who don't know Jesus, but are then deciding, I'm going to use the time I'm on furlough to make meals for my neighbours, that's a good deed, not because he's a Christian or anything like that. He could be a Sikh, could be a Muslim, but every good deed ultimately only comes from God. The devil can't do that.
Yeah, I
like the story of John Piper. Sorry.
Go on.
I think I like that, and that sounds great, Edmund. I like that.
Well, I mean, it's not simply one thing, is it? I mean, but that's the side that means a lot to me. So I will encourage any good I see in anybody. And Paul says at one point, when someone who doesn't know God does what God requires, he will trump the guy that knows the law of God, but doesn't do it. Paul recognizes that there can be Gentiles, and Jews certainly do, recognize that's where the whole idea of the righteous Gentile, the people who saved people from the Holocaust that weren't Jewish, they're called righteous Gentiles because there's this thing in the Bible about a righteous Gentile. Job is considered the example of the righteous Gentile because he's not Jewish. No theologian will call Job Jewish. He's not Jewish.
You're referencing Romans 2:14, Edmund. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts, now accusing, now even defending them. So,
and the other thing about that, do you remember Nineveh? They're not believers in God, and yet they obey God when Jonah goes to them. And so Jesus says in the gospel that in Judgment Day, I can't remember who he was talking to, but he says the men of Nineveh will rise up as witnesses against you because they obeyed Jonah, and they will trump you. I can't quite remember the context, but that's Ninevites, and they're not. In fact, they were the implacable in Jewish society at the time of Jonah. To talk about the Ninevites was they were the most as a typical group of the people who were the worst of the worst was the Ninevites, which is why Jonah isn't so keen to go to them, because he doesn't have a very high opinion of them. They had the same sort of attitude about the Ninevites as in Jesus's time people had about the Samaritans. They were just beyond the pale.
it's woe to you, Chorazin, and woe to you, Bethsaida.
That's it.
Yeah. It's the mighty works which were done in you. Yeah.
Yeah.
On the righteousness in Paul, I just pulled up some, whilst we were chatting, I pulled up some notes which might or might not be helpful. Let me just find, that's the one. So the Greek word is diakosonai, is translated as both justice and righteousness. Two words in the Hebrew, tzedakah, righteousness, and mishpat, justice, were used so often together in Psalms and Prophets that the principle of hen diadis, a single idea expressed by two words linked together by and, permits us to speak of them as if they were the same word. Hence, in the Septuagint, they were both translated by diakosony. When we read of the righteousness of God, it also means the justice of God, and most important, it means the action of God in making conditions and relationships right. Righteousness has the force of a verb rather than a noun. It is not a static quality, but a continual going out in power to effect what it requires, to rectify. It is this hope of rectification, and not simply that of forgiveness, that constitutes the eschatological Christian hope. Righteousness does not mean moral perfection. It is not a distant, forbidding characteristic of God that humans are supposed to try and emulate or imitate. The righteousness of God is God's powerful activity of making right what is wrong in the world. When we read in both Old Testament and New Testament that God is righteous, we are to understand that God is at work in his creation doing right. He's overcoming evil, delivering the oppressed, raising the poor from the dust, vindicating the voiceless victims who have no one to defend them, as in the Magnificat. And in Ezekiel 35, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. So I suppose the righteousness of God that we're getting is the correction of our relationship with him to become a right relationship with God. And that right relationship with God then allows us to, through the Holy Spirit, to start demonstrating the kingdom in our lives to impact those around us, would be my off-the-cuff comment on that, helped by a not off-the-cuff set of notes that I made earlier this year on righteousness.
Just seeing that.
There's a very, very good book called The Crucifixion by, her name escapes me, and it's a 600-odd page treatise on the crucifixion, and it's very, very good on this whole righteousness. Those are notes I made from Taylor Fleming, I think she's called. No, Fleming Rutledge, that's it. It's a very good book looking at the crucifixion and the impact it has on us and why it happened, and the whole theological history of the crucifixion through the history of the church. So if you're interested in righteousness, I recommend that book. if you've got a few months to try to read it. But it really is a very good book.
Just seeing that note there, it mentioned the same two words that Josh talked about on Sunday, mishpat and tzedakah. And tzedakah, there's a word tzaddik, which means a righteous one. Noah is called a righteous one, and Job and whatnot. And it's lovely that James, who the letter of James, the brother of Jesus, who led the church, he was known to the ordinary people of Jerusalem as the tzaddik, which is the word that comes from that, the righteous one. And when he was killed by Herod, that created a huge uproar in Jerusalem, and the Romans had to sort that out, and the high priest family, which had been misbehaving for 2 or 3 generations, all got thrown out because the people, even if they weren't all believers, so saw the righteousness of God in James. And he was known as a tzaddik, which is not the term thrown around very easily, but it was for a very special person who was seen as being close to God and showing the character of God. So even if they weren't Christians, they recognized that in him, his righteousness.
And in modern Hebrew, the word for charitable giving to the poor is tzedakah.
Yeah.
So it's righteousness because you're giving to the poor. So it's an action to those around you.
Yeah, and James says through religion, I mean, we tend to use religion as a negative. We think for external rather than internal. But in point of fact, I want to be truly religious in the way that James says, because he says true religion and undefiled is to look after widows and orphans and keep yourself unspotted from the world. That's true religion, and I want to be truly religious. But in our culture, in our tradition, religion has got a bad term, and I understand what people mean by it, but it often causes I remember being in the foyer of the church once, and one of those guys, one of the street people was there who tend to come in and be around for a while, tends not to go into the meetings, but is out in the foyer drinking coffee and talking. And he was talking to somebody, and then he said, "Oh well, I'm not religious, but I like to listen to these things," and the person said, "Oh no, I'm not religious," and I thought, "Oh no," because what he meant was that he didn't know that he wasn't like the people in the church who knew about God and followed God. He wasn't. That's what that means. It's what people out in the street called spiritual or religious. They mean someone who believes in God. In the church, when we say religious, we mean falsely into God. And this poor guy saw the look on his face, and he realized that somehow, without understanding it, he'd said the wrong thing. And you saw him sort of shrink a bit and think, "Oh dear, I've obviously put my foot on something and didn't quite understand what I'd done wrong." And I thought, "Oh dear, we've got this word for religion means bad to us." Whereas for the people out there, religion means that you believe in some God or other. And the two don't talk to one another. And I think that's sad. I'd like to rehabilitate the word religion to mean what the Bible says it means.
So we've been on a bit of a rabbit trail, which is great. We love rabbit trails. Well, Edmund and I do. So I'm sorry, guys, that we will often take you on a journey down a rabbit hole, just for our own entertainment, if nothing else. So we've kind of got slightly away from the passage. Edmund, could you just reread your version of chapter 3, verse 5?
Yeah. Chapter 3, verse 5. Here we go. Where's number 5? Oh, here we are. Then looking them over and feeling both anger with them and sympathy for the stoniness of their hearts, he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." And as he held it out, it became restored.
So it's the NIV is he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. So this is quite it's a bit of a confrontation, because they're waiting to see what Jesus is going to do, and Jesus is angry. And we talk about righteous anger, and my understanding of righteous anger is angry at injustice for others, not injustice for ourselves, but injustice for others. And this is a good example of it. So Jesus looked at them in anger because they were more than happy to see this man not healed, rather than contradict their interpretation of the law. Because it doesn't say, in no way does it ever say, do not heal on the Sabbath. That was their interpretation. So they would rather have the man suffer than deal with their worldview. And so Jesus was deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. So Edmund, or anybody, would you like to comment on that? How we might have to be careful about our own stubborn hearts, and what those stubborn hearts might be pointed at. Any final comments, because we've got just a few minutes left?
Edmund's translation was quite different, wasn't it, in feel? It said something about having compassion.
Yeah, I really like this translation, and once you've heard it, you realise it is in the other one, but this makes it clear. It said, then looking them over, feeling both anger with them and sympathy for them at the stoniness of their hearts. And I like that a lot, because
So is that translation justified?
There is, if you look at the second part, can you read, Simon, the second half of that? Anger, and it's the phrase that comes after it.
Deeply distressed.
That's it. It's in the word in the Greek for the distressed.
It's silipio. It's to be deeply distressed or grieved.
Yeah, it's this. And it's
say sympathy.
It's the object.
Say again?
So the Greek does not say sympathy, because I've never heard any translation.
Well, the thing is, the word means it's the direction towards that feeling of distress. That's where there is something in the original, because it turns out that it's the feeling towards. So it's to distress towards. So that's where he links it in with sympathy. It's not quite the same as distress about. And that I love, because that's so typical of Jesus, that he can, you see, one of the things I got into discussions about anger and we shouldn't get angry, and people say, oh, well, Jesus in the temple. And I always felt a bit stuck. And then I began to see the Lord showed me these other places where Jesus got angry. And when you put them next to one another, all of a sudden, it makes the one in the temple look different. Because when you look at all three, this is one of them, the man with the withered hand, and you've got the woman bowed over. I think it says in one of the Gospels, but if it's not that one, there's also one to do with the children, when the disciples stopped the children coming to Jesus, or tried to. One of the Gospels says he was angry with them about it. And when you put all those together, what you see they have in common is that Jesus is never angry on his own behalf. No matter how many, how they abuse the situation in his trial and all sorts of things, he's never angry on his own behalf. But he is always angry on behalf of someone who is vulnerable, who is being denied something that God, in the temple, for example, he's angry on behalf of the Gentiles who are being deprived of a place to come to God. It's on their behalf and on God's behalf, because God is being, the image of God is being obscured by them doing that. He is never angry on his own behalf. And therefore, I do not have permission, if I'm trying to be obedient, to be angry on my own behalf. That's very challenging.
Yeah, I think the Greek is a sense of being grieved rather than sympathy. Looking at the word, but I mean, if you're grieved, that's, it's a sadness. It's a deep, deeply distressed, a deep sadness at their hardness. So I think
I've never read that verse translated with the word sympathy added in. It's always been Jesus was angry and he was grieved at them. Whether we like it doesn't make it accurate.
Well, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. So he's very upset.
Sorry, Simon, but isn't that Mark's gospel when Jesus sees the rich young ruler and he tells him to go, he says, follow me, and the rich young ruler decides not to, and he loved him. So you get that in Mark's gospel, you get that as the lovely expressions from Jesus where you see him not changing his what is his ideals or what he believes, but you see like sad, grieved at the Pharisees' hardness of heart, and how he loved the rich young ruler as well. So I think Mark's gospel shows wonderful the character and the inner turmoil, as it were, of Jesus.
I mean, I accept, Tony, your point. I mean, I've not seen that in other translations, but when I first saw that, it just, there was a sort of inner yes inside me, which, talking to me, was saying, when you are, these people, even if they are beyond the pale, I can't shut the door on them. I must, God's heart is always reaching out towards them. And that, I mean, the root meaning of sympathy, to feel pain with. When Jesus watched the rich man and he loved him, I mean, his heart is yearning for that rich man. And the stoniness of heart, and your heart is going, oh no, I wish you weren't like this. And I think that is totally authentic to the Jesus I know. And therefore I'm not unhappy that I haven't seen sympathy in other things, because I think that teaches me something. Don't shut the door on people just because they don't agree with you or they're challenging what you do. Your heart must always be for them.
Yeah,
and I think that's authentic.
Just looking up a definition online of sympathy, it says feelings of pity and sorrow, which deeply distress, feelings of pity and sorrow, grief. So I can see where they're coming from. That he was angry and deeply distressed at their attitude, feeling pity and sorrow for their state. Well, on that note, I am going to stop the recording.